Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in Genesis and we're moving on to Genesis chapter 34. So last week we talked about Jacob and his confrontation with Esau and how it went much better than he had anticipated and how God was faithful and how God blessed their reunion. And so this week we're switching gears completely and talking about Dinah and the Shechemites. So I'm going to read chapter 34 and we'll get right into today's lesson. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. When Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as my wife." When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock. So he did nothing about it until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk with Jacob. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the fields as soon as they heard what had happened. They were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. But Hamor said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please, give him as his wife. Intermarry with us, give us your daughters, and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it." Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask me. Only give me the young woman as my wife." Because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, "We can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into an agreement with you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you. But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we'll take our sister and go." Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem. The young man, who was the most honored of all his father's family, lost no time in doing what they said, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gate of their city to speak to the men of their city. "These men are friendly toward us," they said. "Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters, and they can marry ours. But the men will agree to live with us as one people, only on the condition that our males be circumcised, as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let us agree to their terms, and they will settle among us." All the men who went out of the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought the trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" So as we can see from first glance reading, this is a very different topic than we talked about last week. This is one of those uncomfortable topics that we've had many times, talking about the stuff in Sodom and Gomorrah, talking about what happened with Lot and his daughters. We've had these uncomfortable topics come up all the time. This week is no exception. We begin the story right in verse 2 by talking about rape, and immediately we get into the topic of circumcision, which often people don't like to talk about as well. And then we get into a scheme by Jacob's sons of how they are going to get revenge, another topic that is often uncomfortable for us. And then we see that they carry out this revenge by murdering an entire city of males and taking away all the women and children and all the plunder for themselves. And then we see in the end, there's a confrontation between Jacob and his sons. So there's a lot of uncomfortable topics and a lot of difficult moments to unpack in this chapter. But starting right off the bat, we see that there is trouble right away when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw Dinah, one of Jacob's daughters, and he took her and raped her. and then he wanted her to be his wife. So he tried to make a treaty with Jacob and his sons and their whole clan, and he wanted to intermarry with them, and he wanted them to become one people, and because he wanted that woman, that daughter of Jacob, and so he was willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. That should serve as a warning for us in our own lives when we lose sight of what is important, when we lose sight of anything but the one thing in our life that we think is important in the moment, and we lose track of everything else and are willing to give up anything for just one thing. That usually is a problem unless that one thing is Jesus Christ. So we need to make sure that we are not acting like Shechem in this story, that we're not blindly just trying to get the thing we want, and we don't care if we hurt the people we love, we don't care if we are called to do anything else, we just want what we want. So we need to take that as a warning, not be like Shechem, because his actions bring death to his whole city in this chapter and bring conflict between these people. So that is a warning for us for sure right off the bat. And then we see that Jacob's sons were very much like their father and their father's father, and this whole line that we've seen have a struggle with deception, and they're constantly, Jacob's whole family line is constantly having deception. We saw it with Abraham being a little deceitful from time to time. We saw it with Isaac. We saw it with Jacob. Now we're seeing it with his children, and as we're going to see in a couple more chapters, it gets very, very problematic when it comes to the story of Joseph. So we're seeing that deception we've talked about so much once again, because they come up with the great idea of let's trick these guys into becoming circumcised, and then we're going to get our revenge. So they come up with this elaborate plan, this elaborate explanation of how they're going to become one people, and they're only willing to do it if the men of Shechem and his whole city, if they will be circumcised. So we see this plan, and Shechem and his whole city agree that this is a great idea because they see greed, and that's another warning for us in this chapter. They are greedy. They think that if they intermarry with these Israelites, they're going to get to have all these children, they're going to get to take the livestock, they're going to try to take what is Israel's, and they're going to try to graft it into their own community, and then they're going to profit, they think. So we see that greed throughout this story is a problem. We first saw it with Shechem at the beginning. He wanted what he wanted. Then we see it here. His whole town got on board with this, and they just see an ability to profit, so they're willing to go along with whatever so that they can, in their greed, get something out of it. So they go ahead and they circumcise themselves. But we see here that this was a big mistake for them, because while it says 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain from being circumcised as adults, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. So we see the consequences of the choices people are making in this story. All throughout it, we see so many different choices people are making that are not necessarily good choices. And we see here the consequences it comes to a head, and a lot of people suffer because people made poor choices. So we see the problem of vengeance. Vengeance is a serious problem. And for us as Christians, we're told that vengeance is the Lord's and that we are not to take revenge. We see that in the book of Romans, chapter 12. It tells us that vengeance is the Lord's. It is his to repay. We're not supposed to take revenge. Instead, we're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to pray for those who persecute us. We're supposed to turn the other cheek. And it's an uncomfortable topic nowadays in the Christian world because we don't like to live that principle out. We like revenge because we are normal human beings just like everyone else. We want to take revenge for those we love, for ourselves. Whenever someone wrongs us or someone that we love, we want to pay them back. And we think that we deserve it, even as Christians, that we have earned that right to pay someone back when they wrong us. But as Christians, we're called to be different. Just as the Israelites here, they're called to be different. They're called to be God's people. And even though they did not have the Old Testament law, and they didn't have all these commands and regulations, they were supposed to be different in this section. And we see that Jacob's sons were not acting in accordance with their father, because at the very end of the story, He is not thrilled at all. He warns them that they did something wrong because they could face the wrath of all the other people around. It could be just this one big potluck of revenge where everyone's going to annihilate each other. And so he warns them about that. And we get maybe a first glimpse of why vengeance is not a good thing for us to carry out. We need to leave it to God to take revenge, to leave it to Him to repay people for what they've done, good or bad, not try to be the judge and jury ourselves. So we need to see these different warnings in this chapter, and that's another one, the revenge problem, and we need to try to avoid that by not following the example of these sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi. And then we see that Shechem and his father and their decision and the people's decision to try to be greedy and to try to get ahead of the Israelites by entering into this treaty with them, and then they're going to try to take what is theirs. We see the consequences of those actions. By blindly agreeing to these terms, they set themselves up to be in a position of defenselessness. They were not able to defend themselves because they were all in such agonizing pain that the entire city was wiped out, all the males. And then the women and the children were carried off, and all the plunder was carried off, and the Israelites had the ability to take all of that themselves, so they profited in this situation. However, there were, as we talked about, there were consequences, and there were problems with that. But these guys, the guys who had committed the rape, the guys who had committed these plans of how they're going to take advantage of the Israelites, they did not succeed. And so we see how even though people were not acting in accordance with what God would want us to do, we see how God was still protecting his people, how he was still taking care of them, and how he was still working throughout a very difficult and uncomfortable story such as this one. So when we look at stories like this in the book of Genesis, as we're going from the beginning and going throughout Scripture, we are able to see that even in the most uncomfortable stories, even in the stories that we think we can just skip over, we see important details, and we can see how there's so many different life lessons in stories such as this. And then next week, we're going to return back to Jacob, and the story is going to pick up again with him. So I would encourage you to read this chapter, read Genesis chapter 34, read it and think about what we've talked about today, and then join us next time for another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.